Welcome to this Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and the Center on U.S. Politics. My name is Thomas Gift. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center on U.S. Politics at UCL, who's co-hosting this event. America and the world, it's fair to say, are holding their breath in anticipation of next week's U.S. election. We've become so inured to the phrase, most important election of our lifetime, that it's lost meaning for some. But what's undoubtable is that the stakes of November 5th are high and the outcome is anything but certain. We're very fortunate to have a great lineup of speakers here to help us make sense of all of this. First, James Boyes, who is a Boston-based analyst focused on U.S. political history. He was most recently a visiting research scholar at the Center for Strategic Studies at Tufts University. James frequently shares his insights as an on-air commentator for leading media outlets, and he's the author of several books, mainly centered on the Clinton administration. Next, we have Ali Cerrone, who's an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at LSE, with a joint appointment in the Department of Government. She is also a non-resident fellow in the Democratic Innovations Program at Yale University. And Ali is one of the editors and co-founders of Broad Street blog, which focuses on historical political economy. And lastly, we have Julie Norman, who's an associate professor in politics and international relations at UCL. She has published widely on security, conflict, and foreign policy, including 5 books. Julie is also a frequent political analyst on international media outlets, and I can certainly say that the Center on U.S. Politics would not be a fraction of what it is without her contributions. So just in terms of the format for this evening, each speaker will deliver some opening remarks, about 3 to 5 minutes. Then they'll have a panel discussion, and then finally we'll open it up for your questions. Just a few details before we get started. The whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. If you speak, you will be heard in the recording. We'll let you know when the recording is available, and we hope that you might share it with others. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. James, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I hope, can you hear it at the back? Because there's no microphones. Yeah. That's a yes. Thank you very much. Can I thank you all for coming out? I know your time is precious, and there's an awful lot of similar events like this, because every 4 years, everybody who's ever been to Disneyland, I think, comes out and professes to be an expert in US politics, and is going to tell you exactly what happened. And not quite as much as they'll tell you they knew what was going to happen after the event, but there we are. Let me thank Thomas and Julie and Ali. It's a real pleasure to be sharing the stage with this evening. I've got a few things I just want to flag up, if I might, before we move on to everybody else and eventually to a Q&A situation. One of them is that I can tell you from experience that whatever you think about the United States, if you're not there at the moment, particularly if you're not American, it looks very, very different once you're there than if you're here in Europe. And I speak from some experience from that. I've known Thomas and Julie for many years now, and for about a decade I used to be going on national television and pontificate about what the US was going on there and how things were. And I look back now and question whatever actually I knew, because once you're on the ground there, it is a very, very different ball game. What you don't see, I don't think, channeled through a lot of the national media is some of the issues there, the healthcare issues, the cost of living, the issues to do with fentanyl. And of course this is also borne out in the US. One of the problems is that American politics in particular, maybe much like over here as well, is becoming like the ultimate Rorschach test. What you see depends upon where you look and what you choose to see. I think the American public are increasingly being driven into their own silos. They're watching the networks they choose to watch. They're getting the polls they want to receive. And as a result, when the election results don't go their way, they wonder what on earth's going on. They think, have they been lied to? Is there misinformation? Or is there foul play at stake? And I'm sure that will come out in the next couple of days, regardless of whoever wins, frankly. Secondly, one of the interesting things, again, thinking about how the media portrays this, and this isn't an attack on the media, I think there's some wonderful people working in journalism, but the way that the poll is being presented all too often focuses upon national polls. And of course there is no national poll, and this is not a binary election. One of the great challenges facing both parties is that nobody can quite figure out the impact of third-party candidates, and poll after poll is ignoring that impact. And as we saw in 2000 and in 2016, when Democrats lose at this level, it's all too often not by being beaten by their Republican opponent, but by the more, I'm going to use the word extreme, the further to the left candidate, which chips away and denies a victory to the Democrats. I want to probably just pause at that point and pass the baton on. And I look forward to any questions that you might have. I've also, by the way, if anybody's interested, everybody's always on about, thinking that we're going. I've actually put a forecast on my website if you're interested in seeing what that is, which is jamesdboys.com. So I put my money where my mouth is, if nobody else will.
You're not going to tell us what it is?
Drive them to the website.
I'll make you ask. Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here, like Thomas said, and thank you very much for the invitation. I recently just left the U.S. and moved to London about a month ago to take a job at the London School of Economics, School of Public Policy. It's really great to see all of you come out and be interested in what's going to be a very, very exceptional election. For those of you who are worried, concerned, stressing out, I have a couple tips for you before Tuesday to kind of keep expectations manageable, right? The things you should not pay attention to. Polls, for example, the race is too competitive, and most polls at this point are within the margin of error and after a substantial portion of the population has already been voting. So they're not going to tell you anything. You're not going to get the battleground state poll at this point that will let you know who wins the election. So try to ignore the polls. Early voting numbers, they're tempting, right? They're exciting. We want to glean patterns about registered voters on either side, whether they're low propensity voters, whether they're female voters. Those are interesting, but again, they're not tea leaves, right? They're not necessarily going to tell you what's going on because we're not sure how these patterns of voting are shifting, particularly after the pandemic. And finally, stay away from the betting markets, or at least looking at the betting markets. What you do in your own time is up to you. But this, again, is not what we use to kind of predict outcomes, and there's been a lot of manipulation of the betting markets, right? So if you can, come to things like this where you get real information and stay away from all of this. But like I said, I think it's going to be an exceptional election, and kind of for two reasons I'd like to highlight that you should just think about over the next week. One is the role of elites, right? And so forget former President Trump, but elites particularly in the Republican Party. So we know that voters are myopic, they have their own lives, they rely on political parties to kind of shape political competition, right? And the fact that, Republican elites, that one major party has adopted a lot of this fascist rhetoric, anti-democratic rhetoric, right? Like the individuals that were ultimately responsible for potentially stopping a Trump run, let it happen, right? And so that is going to be, I think, analyzed by historians for years and years to come, right? So it's not necessarily, two-party competition, but what happens when mainstream conservative parties get co-opted, okay? And this is also, again, it's kind of for those of you who are interested in electoral law, majoritarian electoral systems are subject to this, right? But also one ray of hope that's happened in the past couple of weeks, which I think will end up being decisive, is that Republican elites within the party are now telling their own voters to choose country over party, right? So to vote for Harris and not for Trump. So do whatever they want on the down ballots, but don't vote for Trump. And this is remarkable, right? This is absolutely amazing. And when we think, if you go to kind of social psychology literature and how we learn things and how we update from information, you don't listen when the other party tells you what to do because you have your identification, you have your partisanship. When leaders, when mayors of red cities in battleground states say, hey, it's time to turn around, like you cannot vote for the leader of this party, there's a good chance that voters will update, right? So the independent voters who maybe used to want to register as Republican and now feel uncomfortable, or Republicans who, secret ballot might break for Harris. And so I actually think this is going to be consequential both for the future of the Republican Party, the fact that, the Civil War is now kind of erupted into a don't support either candidate, but also for the ultimate vote, because it only takes handfuls of voters in these battleground states, and if those come from former Republican voters, all you need is a little, right? And so that might end up being decisive. And finally, last thing I'll say is that I think it's going to be a turnout game. I also have a prediction, which I guess maybe we'll share later, and I think the ground mobilization of a campaign that started weeks and weeks ago is really, really impressive. And so that's the one thing. The Democrats have the advantage in turnout. Republicans are typically not as good at turnout. And then in particular, under Trump's reign, all of the money that used to go to getting voters out and supporting down ballot races are now going to legal bills, right? So no, I am not kidding, guys. It's fun. It's basically being funneled into the coffers of him. But so at the end of the day, the Harris-Walz campaign ran a better campaign, right? Like in the battleground states, overall, the coalitions, the enthusiasm, the support, the rallies, the money, the 2-to-1 spending. So if they lose after running such a good campaign, I think we seriously, we being Americans, we being the world, need to think about what that means for voters and what voters want. Right? Because a candidate that does poorly in the actual process of getting election but gets elected anyway, it means that there's some deep-seated things that we need to address. And on that happy note, I'll pass it over.
Great. Well, again, thank you to the PNP staff, to Thomas and Cus for organizing, and nice to be here with James and Ali tonight. I was asked to speak about the foreign policy angle, so I'll just start by saying, don't really believe anything I say, because we have one candidate who's known to be very unpredictable, and one candidate who's very unknown on foreign policy. So a lot of us making these foreign policy predictions, it's really a lot of guesswork at the moment, so I'll say that. The second thing I'll say is don't believe everything the candidates are saying right now about foreign policy either, because while there's a lot the president can do on their own in the foreign policy sphere, a lot of that's going to be constrained by Congress and by the Senate in particular. So I'll comment on some of that. And the last thing I'll say is don't believe kind of the idea that the future of democracy for the world or the end of the world is coming with this election. I mean, maybe you can, but like my take on this is not so much a democracy versus autocracy kind of election, at least from foreign policy, as much as it is one of a more internationalist, what we'd say multilateral worldview or foreign policy approach, and one that is more America first and isolationist. So that still matters, and it matters a lot, and I'll just kind of walk through where it matters with Ukraine, with the Middle East, and with China. So first with Ukraine, I think this is where Europe and the UK is very focused, especially with some of Trump's prior comments about possibly withdrawing from NATO, weakening NATO, and then his comments about Ukraine in particular. I'll say a couple things. First, the US Congress made a rare bipartisan bill around this time last year that prevents the president from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO. So it's very difficult for them to do that now. That was largely to safeguard against a second Trump presidency, but that is on the books now. He can still weaken NATO significantly, but we will most likely, the US will be staying in the alliance. On the Ukraine war itself, Trump has famously promised a deal in a day. We don't know exactly what that would look like, but it would most likely include a sort of land for peace deal, so ceding some parts of Ukraine, probably Crimea, the Donbass, in exchange for cessation of hostilities, and also probably halting Ukraine's pathway to NATO membership, so a kind of a guaranteed neutrality. So those are the two things I think we'd expect Trump to push. Harris, on the other side, I think would still try and maintain military aid for Ukraine. The U.S. is the single largest provider of military aid for Ukraine to date. I think that will be difficult for her to do if she does not have Congress on board with her, and both houses of Congress in particular. There will be a lot of pushback, especially from the GOP, from the Republican Party, and even from many moderates within that party. And I'll just take a minute to say, I think there's a lot of assumptions sometimes in the UK that the growing Republican stance on this is because of Trump and his coziness with Putin, or that he doesn't like Ukraine. There might be some of that, but I would say this is much bigger than him in this positioning in the party. Some is, again, just more this isolationist wing that wants more money staying in the US, defending US borders, going to US programs, et cetera. The second part of the party is that is very engaged in foreign policy, is actually more hawkish, but thinks that resources need to be going and reserved for China, which they see as the main threat, not for Ukraine. And the third part of the party is that says, we do think there's US interests and values involved with supporting Ukraine, but how long can we keep doing this? What is going to be the end game? If there's going to be a negotiated settlement at some point anyway, why aren't we just moving towards that instead of just renewing the funding over and over again? So I did just want to take that little side note, because I think in Europe sometimes that sense of how can the US, or some in the US, be taking that position is kind of lost. So Ukraine, I do think we'll see a big difference between these candidates. I'll pivot to the Middle East. This is where I work the most, so I can nerd out on this in the Q&A if people are interested. Here it's a bit more mixed. Both candidates, interestingly, have said they want the Gaza war to end. How they see that ending, I think, would differ, but they both have said they think this war needs to stop, and even Trump has said that on multiple occasions. I think they'd be very different on the West Bank and some other long-term visions for Israel-Palestine, and I can talk more about that. But for the Gaza war itself, I think they will both want this to wind down. We'll also see similarity. They both support a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This was on the table pre-October 7th, and I think they would both like to bring that back. Where they differ a lot on the Middle East is on Iran. Trump would likely push for maximum pressure on Iran, would probably greenlight Israeli strikes on more sensitive nuclear sites and oil sites and what have you in Iran, whereas the Harris administration, I think, would follow Biden in cautioning restraint on those kinds of tactics. So I would say there's definitely differences in the Middle East, but it's a little bit fuzzier and a bit more niche and intricate than just the Ukraine stance. And finally, I'd say with China, both parties and both candidates have a pretty tough on China approach. This is one thing that's been pretty consistent across US politics in a very polarized time. One of the few bipartisan bills that went through recently was something called the CHIPS Act, which was kind of tailored towards competing against China. But again, even here, there's differences. The main policy we've seen from Trump regards tariffs. He's promised up to 60% tariffs against anything coming from China, which if you think inflation in the US is bad now, like wait till that happens. And then for Harris, I would say it's a bit more of this, what we've seen under Biden, something called integrated deterrence, which involves working with allies like the UK to deter China militarily, working with allies in the region to diversify supply chains, and trying to push for diplomatic relations when possible. So those, I would say, are the three regions we're watching. The last just issue I'd say there's a big difference between the two is climate change, which I know is very interesting for a lot of our students here. So I'll stop there. We look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. So we're just going to do a panel discussion, and then I'll be opening this up to the audience. The first thing that I wanted to ask picks up on something that you said, Julie, but any of you are welcome to answer. And that is, you said democracy is not on the ballot in foreign policy, but what about domestically? This has obviously been a key part of Kamala Harris's message that democracy is at stake. It's two questions. One, is that accurate? And then two, is that a strategically smart move by her campaign?
Yeah, so I'll start this one out. We have heard a lot about, democracy is on the ballot for the US and for the world. I said the foreign policy angle, I think we can frame it a bit differently. For the US, I think for me and many Americans, seeing January 6th and seeing more the months that led up to January 6th and the attempts to challenge the election results by Trump does make democracy on the ballot to some degree, just with how we saw Trump's actions at that time. I think there are many people who felt Trump's actual policies in office were not that different from any other kind of generic Republican, but it was what happened after the election that really changed him into being someone who was being seen as potentially authoritarian or threatening US democracy. So I do think those threats are real. I do think those tendencies are real. With that said, I do think that overemphasizing that in the election campaign, it will mobilize some Democrats, but in terms of reaching swing state voters, moderates, that rhetoric we've seen from focus groups and polling, not just my own opinion, does not reach Americans as much and does not mobilize Americans as much as the economy, as inflation, as everyday issues that people are facing. So I think the campaign was recognizing that initially, but they've kind of swung back a bit more into the democracy versus fascism space of late, and I'm not sure how that's working out for them.
Ali or James, do you have anything to add?
So I agree. I agree with the latter part, where unfortunately telling folks that democracy on the ballot is not great at getting folks to turn out, because the folks who already know that democracy is on the ballot are active, they've chosen a side, they're probably going to vote for you anyway. But this just tells you how kind of important data is to campaigns. So, I mean, we do political polling to kind of see who's ahead, but also issue polling is really important. So a lot of times, the media and pundits sometimes make mistakes about inferring that border states only care about immigration, while if you ask border states, citizens in border states, they care about the minimum wage. They care about the cost of living, whether they're a first generation, whether they're related to populations who've shifted. And so so I don't think and you're right, we've seen there's been a couple of recent academic studies that have come out and said that focus groups are not responding to the democracy matters. But it is the case that the Harris campaign has done a lot on policy. But unfortunately, that gets washed out, right? So the policies that distinguish her from Biden, some of the healthcare things, that gets flooded, or that gets washed away by a flood of either Trump controlling the narrative by something, like driving around in a truck on an airport in a vest, right? You don't hear the actual policy things that are being offered, which is what you need to do to turn out some of these voters. So, but that's just, the media environment is a whole other problem.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is, it appears at least, that you have seen a discernible shift in the Harris approach to the campaign when she first emerged as the unveiled candidate. She presented herself as a joyful warrior with her running mate, and presented very optimistic approach to the future. She presented herself as an agent of change. And that, I think, resonated with an awful lot of people. I think it galvanized her core supporters, who I think had been dismayed, frankly, by the apparent, I don't know, I'm trying to phrase this nicely, but clearly the challenges that Joe Biden was facing that caused him to be replaced on the ticket. I think then you saw a shift. I don't know whether you agree with this or not, but there seemed to be a shift between the approach that she took, which was very optimistic and positive, and I think saw her poll numbers soar, frankly, to a point where they were horrifying Republicans and Donald Trump in particular. And I think at that point you'd seen in a complete 180 in terms of predictions about where the presidency was heading. I think after the first debate with Joe Biden, I think many people thought, crikey, this is not looking good if you're a Democrat. I think Kamala Harris took charge of that and presented a very positive view. Then, for reasons which we might get into, we might not, they might not even be discernible, there seemed to be a shift away from a positive approach, which seemed to be working, to an attack upon the opponent and a suggestion that voting for Donald Trump would bring about the end of democracy, and it all went very, very negative. Now, the reasons for that will probably come out after the election, whatever the result is. We're bound to get a whole host of books. They'll flood the market, I'm sure, come the spring, and we'll get an inside track about what it was or wasn't going on inside the Harris campaign. I don't think it's worked. And from Julie's point of view, and I'm not quite sure, Ali, whether you would agree, but I think going negative, I think it's had a negative impact upon her campaign. I know it's famously said that people vote out of fear, not love, but I think if you're Kamala Harris, you want to be presenting yourself as a real change agent. I think she struggles with that as someone who's obviously going to be continuing at administration, and it's surprising, frankly, that she didn't have a better answer when the obvious question about, well, how are you going to differentiate yourself from Joe Biden? How are you going to be a change agent after 4 years of being the incumbent? That would have been an obvious question, I think, that she should have been well placed to answer. And it's interesting how the polling has come together. I would agree totally with Ali's opening remarks, by the way, about the situation with polls. They have tightened. They are close. And again, coming back to my opening remark, the idea that depending upon which network you look at, you will find one poll that tells you one thing and one poll that tells you another, and you'll take succor or despair from either one, depending upon your view. But I don't think democracy is on the ticket this year, because unfortunately that's levelled at Republicans every 4 years.
But so there was actually a third strategy. So I agree that we're seeing all sorts of different ads from the Democrats, right? And some of these are happening in different places, which is really interesting. And like whether these worked and stuff, again, you'll have to do a postmortem.
Yeah.
But there was a third strategy where the Democrats started calling the Republicans weird, right?
Went away though, right?
But no, but it went away. So again, you kind of see peaks. But it was the case that, so remember Michelle Obama, I think it was, who said we go high, they go low, we go high. So we take the high ground, speaking for the Democrats, right? Which is where Republicans have had like slanderous attack ads, really nasty, while the Democrats were supposed to be doing policy. And so for the Democratic advertising to start calling out by saying this is weird, this is strange, right? That was kind of a step towards being more on the offense, right? Not being on the defense. And then you have the democracy is dying, help it. And then once in the past week or so, when the rally, which basically screamed of fascism, now they're just putting the images of that rally. So, I mean, it's a negative ad, but, it's not propaganda by any means. It's literally just what happened. And so, yeah, I think there's been an evolution, but there were a couple steps in between where the kind of, I think, younger, hipper, different type of people that Kamala staffed her campaign with versus Biden made some choices along the way about how to engage in a social media world. That would be my opinion.
Yeah. So all of you have said that the polls are looking very, very close just in the 5 or 6 days until the election. So what happens in the event that there's a contested election or one or both of the candidates start to get involved in sort of litigation and recounts and this sort of thing? How does that all shake out in the end?
Well, it's going to be a mess.
Concerning.
It's going to be a mess. I mean, we saw it 4 years ago. There was challenges about results there. Those of us who are old enough to remember can remember 2000. That went on for several weeks as Al Gore, understandably, frankly, contested that election. That was a real mess. Does anybody here think we'll get a result on the night?
No.
No?
No.
The challenge is, as we're saying, the polls are there to be read, but are they to be believed? It's so difficult, quite frankly, I think, because, again, one of the challenges is, if you were to forecast a Donald Trump presidency, for example, and a victory there, that does not necessarily mean that you think he's going to blow the opposition out of the water, because things are so tight, quite frankly, that either major candidate could win quite a landslide electoral college victory by winning a tiny margin of victory in each state, because in large part, again, because of the presence of third-party candidates whose success in getting to the polls is very difficult to speculate upon. But historically, if you go back to 2016, for example, and 2000, when they were pivotal, if these people are getting 1.5%, 2% in key swing states, that could be enough to hand victory from a very positive result for Kamala Harris to a sudden victory for Donald Trump, which I'm sure many people would be horrified by, but it's certainly not beyond the realm of population. I should point out, by the way, any forecast I make is not based upon any preference, merely just by looking at how close these things are and a distinct possibility of turnout. But this is going to get messy, I think, very, very quickly, I think. And Donald Trump loves the courts. He's a builder he's made a career out of basically, getting in front of the courts, suing, threatening to sue. If he doesn't like the result, he'll appeal and appeal and appeal and appeal. We saw that in the interregnum between the election last time and January 6th, and I think he'll pursue a similar approach if he's not immediately successful.
Yeah, I'd say I think we'll definitely see litigation. As Thomas often says, both sides are quite lawyered up and are kind of ready to go for this. I do imagine we'll see ample protests and demonstrations and whatnot, especially if there's a difference between the popular vote and the electoral vote winner. And, you know, I mean, Democrats, I think, will come out in droves if Trump is reelected, especially if there's a mismatch there, and the reverse for Republicans and Trump supporters. I don't think we necessarily need to be, like, bracing for another January 6th. I think because that happened, everyone is worried about it, and there will be a lot more security mitigation and whatnot around that. But there will be protests and demonstration. All you need is a few people to change an otherwise nonviolent protest demonstration into something that is considered violent or a riot and whatnot. And so I would not be surprised if we see episodes of political violence, but I caution against the narrative of careening towards an American Civil War or World War III and some of this more alarmist kind of language that you hear in the States right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also worth noting that, you know, the polls are within the margin of error, right? That's why we can't, it's not that we can't, you know, competitive polls, that doesn't mean we can't trust competitive polls. Polls can be very close and outside of the margin of error and tell us something, but they're not. So all these battleground states right now are within the margin of error, which is why we're like, look, could go the other way. I think both sides are prepared. And both sides and all of the levels of government, I think, are prepared, right? And so local level, state level officials know that the stop the steal narrative is pretty powerful, and that, you know, lawmakers all over, you know, this federal system on both sides are basically getting ready for these challenges. So it's not like they're coming out of nowhere. And certainly the Harris-Walz team is prepared for a legal challenge at the level of the Supreme Court, right? So if it's tied or something like that. Now the best way to kind of stop this is by winning big. You know, if someone wins really big, then the electoral fraud claims disappear. But you know, at this point, it's also really important for actors like the media and for trusted officials to put narratives to the American public that says, look, we won't have the answer on the day. This is how we count early ballots. The viral video that you saw of people stuffing ballots was was fake. Like, this was not actually true. So, and warning folks that, look, there's going to be disinformation. There's going to be a lot of rumors and lies around the election. It's called pre-bunking, right? So if you warn people, hey, someone's going to try to deceive you, they're more aware of it, kind of like a vaccine, an inoculation, right? And so as much as possible, you have seen, you know, actors in the U.S. try to both prepare for this on the legal side, prepare for it on the day, and then also warn the American public that some of these narratives, like, don't let them stick, right? Because they're going to try to convince you that because the votes came in late, they're fake, right? When that's a perfectly legal part, right? But it's something that I don't think is going to go away, right? So the idea that you can just call the election fake even though it wasn't, and get traction, get coverage, get, you know, press off of this. This strategy has now kind of come out of Pandora's box, and so I think this is going to be continually used, and we need better defenses against it.
Can I come back to one thing?
Yes.
Life gets interesting, if you haven't figured this out yet, because Ali used a great expression, which is win big, and I agree,
Yeah.
right? The class, what you really want is, in many ways, if you're going to try to unify the country, you want a landslide so that there's no question about who won the election. The problem is, how do you define what win big means? Because, as I'm sure you're all aware, you can win the popular vote by several million, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, and lose the presidency to someone who might end up with an electoral college vote over 300, which is considered a good score. So we could end up with someone who wins big with the popular vote, and someone else who wins big with the Electoral College, at which point both sides, the supporters, are saying, hang about a second, we've won big, but only one person goes home with the presidency. I should point out, this wasn't mentioned, and again, I would hate to be pointed here as the fascist supporting Trump guy over here. I actually wrote a biography of Hillary Clinton 8 years ago and expected her to win, so forward that to us.
So it's certainly understandable why we're all consumed with the presidency, but of course that's not the only election that matters this time around. We still have control of Congress and a number of different down-ballot races at the state level and lower levels. So what can we expect from them, and how will that impact the ability of either a President Trump or a President Harris to execute their domestic and foreign policy agendas?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to this slightly in my comments that the Senate in particular, right now, the Democrats have a very tiny majority of 51-49. Really the best they can hope for is to keep the Senate at 50-50, win the presidency, and then the vice president becomes the vote that gives you the majority. So the best Democrats can hope for is a 50-50 Senate. They are likely to probably lose a couple more Senate seats than that. There are very close Senate races in Republican-leaning states that have been held by kind of long-term, like centrist Democrats that will, most likely swing the other way. So I think Democrats are got to be prepared that they might not hold the Senate. Either way, again, the Senate, I would say, as many of you know, even if you have a majority, if it's just a small majority, there's not much you can do. The Senate has something called a filibuster that needs 60 votes rather than a 51-vote majority to really pass much significant legislation. So I imagine we'll see a lot of, kind of what people call gridlock in the Senate regardless, but Democrats should be prepared for that chamber to particularly to potentially change hands. The House is also very close and could also flip possibly the other way. I think the House is a bit more debatable, but Senate races right now, I would say, watch those closely. Montana is an important one, Texas, there's a couple other states, but you can just expect the Senate to change.
I would imagine, and again, just in case everybody's not aware, don't forget it's 1/3 of the Senate that's up for re-election and the entire House of Representatives that's up for re-election. And depending upon which seats are up for re-election means it's either more likely or less likely that one party will retain power. I'm going to echo Julie's point and basically suggest that it's most likely just because of how close the current makeup of the Senate is and the seats that are up for re-election, that it's likely that the chamber will go Republican by a narrow margin, I imagine. Which again you'll see the problems that come from that in terms of trying to get anything through the Senate. We've seen for several years, quite frankly, gridlock. Irrespective of whoever's in charge, this is a sort of a plague on both the houses, I suppose, to a certain extent. The extent to which party affiliation has become less and less important, you're seeing, great power brokers effectively emerge, and they seem to be not beholden to party whim, I think. So they become very, very difficult to sort of corral, like a herd of cats, I suppose, in both chambers. We've seen, if you've been watching the last couple of years, you can't help but note the chaos in the House of Representatives that the Republicans have had in terms of trying to manage the Republican majority there. So I think that if the Democrats do prevail at the executive level, and we do have a Harris administration, they're likely to be faced by a Congress of the House and the Senate, which is going to be very, very difficult to navigate. So whatever. Somebody mentioned this in the opening remarks, I forget who it was, sorry, about a promise in the year of election, to quote you two. Don't trust anything you hear. We've lived through that in this country in the last couple of weeks. So whatever it is that's being promised by either Donald Trump or the Democrats, their ability to get anything through is going to be severely limited simply by the makeup of whatever Congress they face moving into the new year.
So the one thing that we can be sure of is that as soon as one election is over, we start thinking about the next election. And so I'm curious what the Republican Party looks like post-Trump, assuming he loses, or what the Democratic Party looks like post the Biden administration and Harris, assuming that they lose. Are there sort of any big changes that we can expect?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the Republican Party has changed significantly since 2016, since Trump's first run. I mean, then he really was the outsider, and now it really is Trump's party. We've seen that in shifts in the policies and a much more populist approach, et cetera. With that said, I mean, I do think if Trump is not on the ballot again, it does reorient the party in some degree. He is just a very unique kind of character and politician, but I don't see the party swinging back to the kind of pre-Trump kind of era. I think it'll stay in more of that populist space for quite a while to come. And for Democrats, I think that we have seen there's a lot of really young up-and-coming talent in the Democratic Party. I think if they had had an open primary this year, you would have seen that on display a lot. But I think going into 2028, you'll see a lot of a very new set of faces and people with different kinds of vision for where the party might go. So I think we'll see a bit of a refreshing of the page for both parties going into 2028.
And one of the issues that relates to the prior question is that, unfortunately, thanks to gerrymandering and kind of geographic and social sorting, a lot of these races aren't competitive, right? Which is why, there's not as much moderation in terms of, you have these districts where very extreme candidates can run and they know they'll win basically regardless because there's kind of almost no competition. And so that will stay the same. So even if Trump leaves, like, the legacy will be a lot of extremist candidates that still probably could do well for a while. And it would take, again, the mainstream moderates in the Republican Party to forcibly use whatever they have, because parties are weaker in the U.S. than they are in Europe, for example, to try to reshape the party. But that's very difficult to do. And so whether the Republicans will do it, I don't know. But I think the down ballot races will be interesting. One thing that the Trump campaign is not doing this cycle is helping the down ballot races, right? So funneling money to not the presidential race, while there's a lot of reasons that not only is the Democratic campaign sending a lot of money and sending their surrogates, I mean, they were in Texas, right? Texas is not a battleground state that you would think of, but so either their internals were really good or they're looking for their future. They're saying that some of these states that we think are red, we're actually seeing movement, and some of this, Texas was helped by ground game organizing by Beto O'Rourke for years and years. So on the down ballots, we actually might see some interesting movement because there's been so much effort by the Democrats across, kind of the wealth was shared. And then finally, Roe v. Wade, do not underestimate, right? So if we're seeing like low propensity voters, so folks who have not voted before register as women on the Democratic side, there are issues that are at the top of some of the states, right? So like, enshrining abortion law into the state constitution are also on the ballot. And if that gets people out that maybe wouldn't have voted before or mobilizes different camps, that could also affect down ballot races in ways that we don't anticipate. So you're right, I do think we focus on the presidency, but there could be swings in down ballots that we didn't think were competitive necessarily, but because this is such a unique election, they might be.
So I'm sure we've got lots of questions, so we'd love to open it up to the audience now. Go in the back there. Yes, sir.
I'm just reading a New York Times headline from 26th of October, 1948. This is Truman, likens Dewey, his opponent, to Hitler as a fascist tool. Truman tells Chicago audience, a Republican victory will threaten U.S. liberty. Truman, big imperilment to liberty. So this, clearly from that evidence, calling your opponent Hitler is quite useful, and I'll be interested to see what happens in 74 years' time. But the point of this, that's just fun. In terms of the point of reflection, why are we seeing this shift in black, Muslim and Hispanic populations to Trump? What do you think is going on there, motivating these? How do we explain that?
Who wants to start?
All right.
It's a tough question.
All right, thank you very much for your question. I appreciate it. I knew the fascism line was going to come up because it's been bandied around left, right, and centre. The New York Times, in particular, Peter Baker, who's a journalist I've got a lot of time for and have been fortunate to meet a few times, has been using it as well, which I think is misplaced, quite frankly. The challenge you've got is, I was going to say this has been going on since at least '64 when Goldwater emerged, and he was portrayed as, the worst individual possibly walking the face of the earth. But as you rightly reminded us, this goes all the way back to Harry Truman, at the very least, quite frankly. I think when you get to that level and you're trying to demonize other Americans, and there's very few people in the whole history of the world that you could probably be compared to in a worse manner than Hitler, especially in Truman's time, and think about how close that was to the war. That's another way to bring people together after an election, quite frankly. And whatever whatever it was, Dewey, I think you were rightly pointing out, whatever else he was. I mean, he certainly wasn't a fascist, or he wasn't Hitler incarnate, any more, frankly, than Donald Trump is. Or the problem we've got, I think, is that every 4 years is that the Republican candidate is demonized to such a point where you think, if you look close enough, you're going to see the tail and the hooves and such like, and then the next 4 years, the next person is worse and worse and worse. So now I'm sure there's a lot of people in Europe who'd like, thank goodness, we wish we could get George W. Bush back for the presidency. I mean, who would have thought that? But that's kind of where we are. Every 4 years, you demonize your opponents. One of the best presidents America maybe never had in recent years was Mitt Romney. He was portrayed as this demonic figure, and he was a moderate Republican from Massachusetts, and yet he was portrayed in 2012. They're trying to tie him, because he'd run Bain Capital. They were trying to liken him to Bane, the villain from the Batman film, which is just absurd, quite frankly. Trying to have a mature, sensible debate and discussion on really important issues, and the United States is facing some great challenges. Healthcare issues, crumbling infrastructure, its place in the world. These are the issues that should be being debated, and not going around name-calling. And before you tell me otherwise, Donald Trump's as bad at this as anybody else, and he's introduced name-calling to a whole new level. The names he threw at Hillary, of course, crooked Hillary, etc., etc. He's taken this to a whole new level. So please don't think this is me sort of just sitting here, suggesting that Donald Trump is innocent of all this. But generally across the board, we really need to basically have a far more mature level of conversation if America is going to proceed and be seen in a better light around the world, I think.
Oh.
Ali, did you have some?
Oh no! I thought you were going to the basket of deplorables comment, given your research. So
Well,
I'll go
terrible,
there
right?
then.
Yeah, okay.
I'll go there.
That's terrible.
So I won't address the fascist, because that was already well done by James. But so how many of you who are students here, raise your hand if you've had to study populism recently? Okay, so a fair number of you, right? Okay, so why are voters who are maybe low income, maybe minority, maybe different segments of society, voting for candidates that are either promising them nothing or are against their own material interests, however you want to define those, right? Now, you alluded to this, where the issue is that there are a lot of voters in the U.S. who are voting for Trump because they are facing struggles, right? They are the losers of globalization. They're in a post-industrialist economy, facing austerity. Their industries are collapsing, and they used to be able to buy a house like their grandparents could and have status in society, and now they don't, right? And they're frustrated. They don't have a grocery store for 40 or 50 miles, right? And so a lot of these groups that are, not necessarily with the Trump ideology, especially the extreme version that's come in recent years, they're frustrated, right? And it is the case that the Democratic Party is not dealing with their frustrations. They're not offering what used to be their traditional base of support. They're focusing on other places, right? And so back to this kind of, name calling, at one point calling Trump supporters a basket of deplorables was not a great thing to do, right? Because that diminishes the fact that there's a reason why people are voting for these types of candidates, and it's not that they're dumb. It's not that they're stupid. There's levels of frustration that are not being addressed by mainstream parties. And so mainstream parties in Europe on kind of the populist, the far right, far left side, in the US in a majoritarian system where the two parties are kind of captured by the extremes. But this is going to be the trick going forward. This is going to be what all Western democracies are going to have to face, which is there are new segments of the population that need help, support, policy, attention, and they aren't the traditional ones that existed in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right? And so this kind of realignment of voting support, and mainstream parties they haven't sorted it out yet, which is why you see the rise of all these competitive parties.
Great. I just realised, I'm sorry, we didn't actually answer your question, did we?
Yeah, we did.
Because your question was about why sections of society, and I'm not sure I don't know if we actually addressed
Well,
it.
I tried.
No, I don't
tried.
I don't think I did either. And so I realised I focused on the first part about the fascism bit, and not about whether Muslim Americans and other sectors of society, why they're supporting Trump. But I'm not sure we actually fully address it, and I would hate for you to
try to.
your head.
I'm just going to try to get a couple questions in here because I know we've got a lot of demand. So I'll have maybe a few of you ask questions, then you can kind of take them as you would like. So right here, yes, right here, and right here. You're welcome to just stand up and ask the question. Or you can sit down, Just try to project, yes.
Okay, perfect, I can do that. I guess my question is, I guess we're seeing a lot on social media right now, especially younger people, sort of really being sort of single issue voters, and there's been sort of this uptick in people deciding not to vote at all, especially over the issue of Israel-Palestine. And I guess I'm just wondering if you have any sense of sort of what the impact of that is going to be on this election.
Okay.
This is a question about foreign policy. Obviously, both candidates are very different in terms of their outlook. And I was wondering how the outcome of the election would factor into specifically Taiwan. How would a win for each candidate affect Xi Jinping's calculus on how far he can intervene in Taiwan?
Okay, and then just a third question right here.
My question actually follows on from the first questioner, really taking on the point that James raised in his introduction about the significance of third-party outlier candidates. Do you think Harris's stance on the genocide will impact on, say, Michigan or anywhere else?
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions on Gaza, one on Taiwan. Julie, why don't you start here?
Yeah, I'll start us out here. So yeah, great questions. Thank you. I would say, right, the war in Gaza is definitely having an effect on younger voters, progressive voters, to the other point, to some Muslim voters, Arab American voters, and just voters of different demographics. I will say this is an area where I've actually changed my opinion in how much I think it'll impact the election or not. As some of you know, one of the big battleground swing states that's really up for grabs is Michigan. Michigan has one of the largest populations of Muslim Arab Americans in the United States. So I think if we see an actual electoral impact, that's where it will be. And I will say, again, the polls that we have established are not super trustworthy, but some of them are showing that Jill Stein, who's a third-party candidate, is polling equally to Kamala Harris right now among at least some groups of Muslim Arab American voters. Anecdotally, I know people who are planning to vote for Cornel West, another third-party candidate. So we definitely know that some of the votes that probably would have gone to a Harris campaign before are going to go to a third party, possibly to Trump, but more to third party or people not voting. And the impact it'll have on the election, I think, is marginal, but because the election is so close, it can still make a difference. So that's pretty much how I answered that. To the Taiwan question, it's a tough one to know. Trump talks very belligerently in terms of China, but in terms of actually committing to any kind of U.S. Military engagement to defend Taiwan, he's been very non-committal, and I think would hesitate to try and do that. The Biden administration under Biden has been very more vocal than the U.S. usually is. Usually the U.S. is intentionally ambiguous on this issue. I wouldn't be surprised if Harris brings us a little bit back to that as well, but my sense is that a Harris administration would be more likely to actually defend Taiwan in the case of a conflict. But right now, all the policy is trying to prevent that. And like I said, with Trump, we just don't know what his stance would be.
Yeah, a few more questions here. Right here, and yes.
Me first. Sorry. You mentioned the media a couple of times. What do you think kind of the failings or successes of legacy media in covering this election have been? And just a second point on that, we've seen kind of the impact of influencers and new media, basically, in this election. How do you think that's playing out for the campaigns, and do you think there's a danger to it, as obviously, Donald Trump avoiding 60 Minutes but doing Joe Rogan, there's less scrutiny to that sort of interview? They're my two questions.
Question is about how we have two different groups of people, very large groups of people, following candidates that dispense a level of detail that anybody would want to know what the leader would execute, and another candidate who does not provide any detail, yet you have a massive following. How is it that we are so split between choosing leaders for a country under different criteria?
Okay, and then a final question here.
Yeah, so my question focuses on the language of decline. and how that's been instrumentalized by not just the Republicans, but also the Democrats. You look at Trump's slogan of Make America Great Again, and also some of the political decisions Democrats have been taking in appointing Tim Walz as the vice presidential nominee, tapping into kind of more of the working class core Democrat vote. What does the rhetoric of decline spell for America and how it views itself, both on the international scene and domestically?
I think that's you, right?
I can take the media one.
Sure.
So that's a really great question. It's really important, right? Because a free press is really important for democracies, right? For accountability and information and everything. On the new media, well, there's a relationship between the two because traditional mainstream news outlets are facing financial crises across the board, even ones that are the New York Times, Washington Post in the States, right? In the UK, be glad that you have the BBC that is funded from the government because it insulates them from these pressures. But we're seeing the collapse of local newspapers, and newspapers are now, and digital platforms too, are now having to collect money via advertising, right? And what happens when you want eyeballs on something? You tend to use clickbait articles that are misleading. You tend to print sensational stories. You're really worried about losing any types of membership, so maybe you make editorial decisions that are not great for the country or for the institutions of newspaper, right? And so, even the top media outlets are facing this, and it's skewing their coverage, frankly. And there's a lot of problems with how they've covered Biden's age, the lack of coverage on policy. Now, social media, on the one hand, is great. So if you've ever read the book #Activism, I would suggest that because new groups can access, they can mobilize. You don't have to have a lot of money to reach a lot of people. But it is the case that now social media companies, Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X, recently, that algorithm is completely biased now, and there's a lot of disinformation about elections on something that's widely used, right? So social media, which has a lot of benefits, not necessarily bad, when it's bought by very, very rich people who then co-opt it for their purposes, it's also not a reliable source of news. So this is going to be really concerning for politics going forward.
I'll try and take the question on leadership, which was an excellent question. I guess I would say both candidates have been a bit scant on policy. I agree that some has just been overshadowed by news noise and whatnot, but in general, both candidates have been pretty light, and Kamala has been pressed to be a bit more specific and has been on a few things, but has kind of dodged on a few others. But I think there's many Americans who want more substance. But I would say this is an example of how I think the U.S. elections are very different from, say, UK ones, where in the UK you have a party with a very clear platform and policies, and people kind of vote on that. In the US, just the whole nature of having a president who you're voting for separately, it becomes a lot more related to personality, to charisma, to these kinds of things. And it used to always be the question, who would you want to have a beer with? Who would you want to hang out with? I heard one thing that I always thought was interesting, that Americans are also starting to ask, which one of these candidates would like me better? Which one of these candidates? And that's why that's why a lot of people like Trump, even if some of his stuff seems to be against their interests, because they think he would like someone like me, and these Democrats would look down on me, and this kind of thing. And so I think these ideas of personality, charisma, that kind of stuff plays in a lot more in American politics, and we're seeing it in this election.
It's interesting. One of the questions raised the use of the expression "Make America Great Again," which I'm sure is an expression that you've all heard of. But anybody know that both Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton used that in their campaigns without any of the backlash that seems to be associated with how Donald Trump uses that? One of the interesting points I thought, and again I'm trying to jump around so it covers as many as was asked, the influencers thing. You've all heard of Taylor Swift, I'm sure, right? Did anybody go to the concert in London this year? One or two of you. I hope you had a great time. Taylor Swift obviously has become involved in this, and there's a big discussion about will Swiftie swing the election. The most hilarious story I've seen in the last 2 weeks is apparently there are Taylor Swift fans who are getting their ballots through and don't want to vote for either candidate. So they are, guess what, writing her in as a candidate for President of the United States. Which of course is actually doing the exact opposite of what it was that Taylor Swift wants to happen, because instead of voting for the Democratic candidate, they are effectively taking votes away and risk basically not electing her in those districts. So when you see these influencers, I don't get who it is. You know, I grew up, you know, adoring Bruce Springsteen, and every 4 years he comes out, gets his guitar out, goes out, strums his guitar, same old song, and tries to get Democrats elected around the country. And I think all he's done in the process is probably alienate many Republican fans who thought you'd become overly political, which is a shame, because there is a place for politics in music, but I think it becomes overtly political every 4 years, and the impact is negligible. And I actually think that what you've seen Kamala doing this year with Beyonce, I think you saw Hillary do it in the last stages of the 2016 election, which is getting far too cozy with billionaire celebrities and actually forgetting who it is that votes. I honestly think you see the same mistakes being made by both teams every 4 years, you know, forgetting who it is that actually votes. And rather than having rallies in Washington, D.C., I would have thought, frankly, that the Democratic candidate would be far better getting out to, you know, the core votes, those swing states, and actually identifying with working men and women who are actually going to make the difference. But that's just my take.
Some other questions? We've got 3 in the middle here. We'll go with those.
Green hat.
With the green hat first.
Yeah, thanks. Just thinking about Joe Biden's comments calling Trump supporters garbage and some of the kind of other stuff being going around him. Do you think Biden could potentially cost Kamala Harris the election? Yeah, pretty much that's the question.
Okay, and then below.
Yes, I was wondering, we kind of all forgot about Project 2025 a while ago, and I was wondering why that was, or where did that go, and what role was it actually going to play once, if Trump wins, he gets in position.
Okay, and then one more here.
I was wondering about more hidden figures in the result of the election. So media tycoons, spin doctors like Elon Musk. How will they impact the outcome of the elections?
Okay, so a lot there. Anyone want to?
You're going to me. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Right. So, will the garbage quote cost the Democrats the election? It ain't going to help. One of the things I think has been fascinating is you've seen this several times over the last couple of weeks, is that the candidate will have an event over here which is all being geared up to be covered by the media, and then for reasons that make seemingly no sense, Joe Biden appears over here. He did this a couple of weeks ago and pops up in the press briefing room, and whatever he says is irrelevant because the networks have now got a massive challenge. Do they focus upon the candidate, which they should be, or do they focus upon the President of the United States, who, you know, no pun intended, trumps the candidate? You've seen in the last couple of days the exact expression you refer to, at the same point that the candidate is out in the ellipse, basically trying to make a very important closing statement to the American people. Joe Biden, on a podcast, I guess it was, speaking, does this rambling role about, you know, making reference to, you know, suggesting, and again, there's some interpretation, because I know the White House would argue with this, but liking Trump supporters to garbage. Now, quite what he said, how it was being spun, is almost irrelevant. That's how it's being interpreted, certainly by Republicans, and the obvious parallel with Hillary's ludicrous remark in the last stage of the 2016 election. You start alienating individuals and demonizing the opposition. It comes back to the question that was asked beforehand. It's no way to lead. It's disappointing at best. There's no love lost, my understanding, between the Biden team at the White House and the Harris team. For 3.5 years, the vice president was seemingly not seen as being particularly effective. She managed to luck into this position. Somebody mentioned earlier on about other Democratic candidates. I think many people would have said it's a shame that the Democratic Party didn't have a mini primary of some sort when it was decided that Biden wasn't going to be the nominee. People like Gretchen Whitmer, for example, might have been in the mix. I'm quite sure Gavin Newsom would have fancied his chances. I'm not sure you've ended up with the best Democratic candidate to go forward to defeat Donald Trump. There's a great point about non-voters earlier on. Non-voters in every state will basically be the largest block of people in this election, unfortunately.
Allie, do you want to take the Project 2025 question?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think it is important, but it is a big negative story about a candidate that's one of many negative stories, I think, right? But the thing is that that level and that level of coverage that it got, which made that campaign have to like address that coverage. So, they had to focus on it, try to get rid of it. Because, this is like a conservative vision for America that's pretty terrifying. I do think that that started to penetrate to, middle class voters, older voters in the suburbs, which tend to be especially in the Midwest. That's what you want. Now, the thing is, it's a lot of drips in a bucket, right? So that is one thing in addition to a lot of other stories that build a picture for independent voters, swing voters, and then the supporters about what does it mean to elect this candidate. So I do think it was influential, but I think it's one of many things going on where, we should be terrified of it, but there are so many other things that are in the news cycle. And wait, can I quickly say one thing about Puerto Rico? So I don't know. The garbage comment from Biden I don't think will do anything, but why was that comment made is because Puerto Rico was insulted at the Trump rally, right? And what happened in response to that is really interesting because a bunch of Puerto Rican celebrities with like 100 million followers on Instagram that maybe you had, and one of them had supported Trump in the past, sent out to all their supporters, Latino voters in some of these states, and then they started campaigning on this, hey, they're not going to do anything for you. And then the Harris campaign was not to engage in the name calling, but was to say, hey, Puerto Rico, I'll give you stuff. I'll help your grid. I will send policy your way. So the combination of something viral that targets a critical group plus a response that includes both policy and, hey, we love you, Puerto Rico, the other candidate doesn't, I think that will matter much more than Biden's response.
Yeah, just to pick up on that with the hidden figures question, there's a couple ways to answer this if I'm hearing it right. One is just these social media influencers who are a bit more under the radar. Like Thomas has written some on some of his influencers who are maybe not household names to like people like me, but are still having an effect. And so there's that kind of element. But I think you're also maybe referring to more like nefarious kind of intrusions as well. Yeah, I would say U.S. intelligence is very well aware of attempts from Iran, from Russia, from China, from different actors to spread misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. That has been, we're just aware of that in that sphere. But I would just caution against overly leaning into that in the sense of the 2016 where it became the narrative that Russian misinformation had won Trump the election and that kind of thing. There's a lot of other things going on, and that misinformation and disinformation is around us all the time, even not in election times, but it is, it is playing a role now as well.
And Elon Musk was also mentioned in this question, so does anybody have any comments on that?
Oh yeah, I can take that. So it is the case that right now he's facing a lawsuit for trying to bribe voters in Pennsylvania, right? Again, co-opting a social media platform to support one candidate. But then also, some of the initiatives that he's tried to do, it's not working and they're not executed very well, right? So it was like Elon was paying canvassers that apparently just took the money and did nothing, right? But I do think we need to be worried about billionaires buying up institutions and using this influence because it's hard to measure, what goes into all of this and to what extent, people on social media tend to follow folks that are already, they like following, and there's a lot of cross-cutting content. But the fact that now we have to deal with disinformation on the platform, stop the steal, election fraud narratives, this is now something that everyone has to be aware of because of a particular set of actions by a billionaire who basically faced no consequences. The more billionaires that do this, the more worried we should be, right? And so, campaign finance is a problem too. We should get rid of that in the United States. But we should be worried, but I don't, it's unclear what he's actually done in this election so far.
So I think we've got time for a couple more questions, if there are one. Yes, here and here.
So everyone knows about Trump's legal cases, and he's already been found guilty on one. One of Biden's inabilities in his presidency is to kind of stop the polarization in American politics. If Harris was to win, let's say, is there any chance that she could kind of commute any one of Trump's sentences or give him a full presidential pardon? And would that be kind of a better step to stop the polarization and kind of bring back some sense of normalcy?
Okay, and then yes, here. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about the energy and environment policy.
Biden's administration did a great job with the IRA. In case Trump wins, would he be able to stop the initiative or hinder it and promote or support fossil fuel companies?
Julie, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. Great. So yeah, two great questions. I would say for the second question was on the so-called IRA, which is a bad acronym here, but it was it's supposed to be Inflation Reduction Act, also a little bit weird. But anyway, it was an act that included a lot of Biden's climate priorities in the U.S. and kind of investing in different kind of green infrastructure and energy and whatnot. Some of that will go forward regardless, and again, there's just been a lot of buildup and development in green energy that's just not going to go away. What I think Trump will undo is he will unwind a lot of the climate-based regulations, and that's something that he did in his first term and will likely do in the second term as well, and that's kind of along with other things he can do in the executive branch. I'll leave the polarization question to someone else.
So this is my opinion, I don't think she should. And I think the type of polarization you're talking about, right, is effective polarizations, right? So dislike of in-group, out-group. We're not seeing ideological polarization. We're seeing, we no longer want our child to marry someone of the other party type of in-group, out-group, right? And I think that all of the cases against Trump and the fact that he's already been found guilty, this is something for courts to decide, right? You want to leave this to courts and support this important institution. None of these crimes are not political. We have evidence over and over and over again that he broke the law. So I do not think she should, and I doubt that she will, as a former prosecutor.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm going to walk on a very fine line in that case. One of the challenges actually about this is it's not actually within her purview to do so for many of the issues that he's facing, because he was brought, a lot of the most serious issues he was facing actually were brought at a state level. And one of the reasons that they were brought at a state level, I believe, is because it was a state level crime, but also because there was a fear that if it was brought at the federal level, he could, in theory, some people thought, pardon himself, or he could be pardoned by a future Republican president. Will Biden pardon him on his way out? My understanding, and I might be wrong, I think pardons have to be requested in some cases, not necessarily always. I know Nixon didn't actually request, but generally the pardon process has to be that it has to go to the DOJ and then it goes to the president. And where Trump was in hot water as president was that he was circumnavigating that process. People who were given pardons by Trump in his first term hadn't gone through the proper process whereby it went to the DOJ considered it, and then it went to the president for his yay or nay, effectively. Will he pardon Donald Trump on his way out? No. If she were to win, would she pardon him? No. Will Joe Biden pardon his son? That's going to get interesting. He said he wouldn't. I think it would be a human story if he didn't. That would be very interesting to see. What is the last act of Joe Biden's presidency, clemency or a pardon for Hunter Biden? That's something to keep your eye on, I think.
Yeah.
I think
don't forget, Bill Clinton, by the way, got into all kinds of trouble and destroyed his legacy in many people's eyes. That was the last thing he ever did. He pardoned a fundraiser and donor to the Democratic Party, Guy Rich, I think his name was. Mark Jacobs, sorry. And it killed his legacy in the eyes of many, many people. Will Biden look at that and think, don't want to go there? Or will he act as a father? That's something very interesting to see. And that will be on January 19th, 20th, so keep your eye on that.
So we could keep going, but just for the sake of time, we're going to stop there. Before we do thank our panelists, let me remind you about our next Policy and Practice event on Thursday, November 14th. That's the Thursday after Reading Week on fixing criminal justice system in England and Wales. This is part of the Policy and Practice mini-series on priorities for the new UK government. You can sign up for that via our website and Eventbrite. If you don't already, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. The department's handle is @UCL SPP. The Center on U.S. Politics is @CUSP_UCL. Thank you so much for a really wonderful discussion. Really appreciate it.